Why did I become a photographer? To avoid having a proper job, I think. I'd taken a picture of Diana Ross at the BBC, and I dropped one off to the Melody Maker as one of the journalists was there. He said, "Hey, old boy, why don't you just drop off a picture of the Melody Maker? We can always use a snap or two." So I went into the office. It was completely freaked out. It was Fleet Street, right? Everybody's smoking, drinking whiskey, old Olivetti typewriters and Remingtons and notepads, and the people interviewing jazz musicians, blues artists. Next week I was walking around my local neighbourhood in Soho, and I saw that Diana Ross picture on the front page of Melody Maker with the credit, and going, "Oh boy, that's great, I've earned 2 and 6pence this week." And it started from that, and I was thrown into this crazy world of musicians and music.
Melody Maker was quite unique, really, because it was the world's first weekly music publication, and lasted for about 50 years, actually, altogether. But it started back in the 1920s. 1926, the first issue came out.
Before rock and roll, long before Elvis Presley, Melody Maker was a musician's trade paper. It wasn't aimed at fans, it wasn't aimed at consumers, it was aimed at the working musician. So if you were a trombone player and you were looking for a job in a pit band, that's in the orchestra pit in front of a musical or something, then you would advertise your services.
And they were promoting what was on the newly formed BBC radio. The BBC had only been going a short time.
We had the Old Grey Whistle Test, which was about the only TV programme that you would see a band that wasn't in the charts, that wasn't a commercial entity.
And discussing matters of interest to musicians, their welfare, their, for example, they had the very strong musicians' union, so they'd write about their activities, promoting musicians, really. So it was a newspaper aimed at musicians, and of course most musicians then, as now, their favourite music was jazz, American music, and so the paper right from the start was concentrating on people like Louis Armstrong and Duke Ellington.
My musical heroes were not the pop stars of the day, but more likely to be the older jazz musicians, classical musicians, folk musicians.
I knew the doorway to stand in. So I got to meet like Big Bill Brunsey, Sonny Terry, Brownie McGee. Yeah.
They were my father's age, and that's what I listened to.
I took it upon myself to look upon rock and roll and rhythm and blues as like almost a religion, and something that I had to preach to the kids of England.
It was out of the Second World War. You still had a sort of Victorian educational system and parental control thing. You left school 15 or 16 or so, and if you're unlucky, you went into a job for the rest of your life, like your parents and whatever. And if you happen to sort of want to do something completely different, then you usually end up in art school, like I did, and many others like Lennon, Clapton, Jeff. It was a default place to go. Mid-60s, it became a more popular paper, and they finally gave in and put the Beatles on the front page, which was half the staff, I think, resigned. Well, that's not really music.
We immediately got promoted because all these other people had left. So I ended up having been there about 6 months as deputy editor, much to my surprise.
It took on from there, and I joined at a point where it had been rejigged, reformatted, and they were starting to use photographs, which was wonderful. And we were the first paper really to be doing that alongside the interview. If we go along to see an artist like Eric Clapton, spend an afternoon at his place, I'd go along with a journalist, and it'd be just like this, sitting around having a glass of wine, maybe smoke, or listening to records or whatever, talking about whatever we wanted, or, you know, and then that would go in the paper with the pictures from that.
We had a big library in the Melody Maker that dated back to the 1920s. There were photographs of people like Jack Hilton and Bing Crosby.
Yeah, Louis Armstrong.
Louis Armstrong. All the papers would have the same pictures, so editors would say, oh, for God's sake, we can't keep using these terrible old stock shots. We've got to get, you know, some new, fresh photographs. Hence, you know, Barry, joining us, gave us a whole new look to the paper.
For someone from the provinces like me to be thrust into the midst of the record business like I was, it was like Aladdin's cave was suddenly opened up and all the jewels were mine to inspect.
Shattering experience. Suddenly, instead of interviewing the mayor of Bexley, I'd be interviewing John Lennon and Paul McCartney. So, you know, it's rather more exciting.
It was like a cause, this music. And, you know, everybody felt very strongly about it. And the musicians knew it was worth reading because the people who were writing for it took them seriously, took the music seriously, loved the music. We went out looking for new things to hear. And we were sort of talent scouts, you know, as well as journalists, which was really great fun. And made us sort of even more valuable to the industry, I think, because they had to keep their eyes on what we were saying.
One of our youngest reporters, Nick Jones, who was just 16 when he joined Melody Maker in about 1966, I think it was, and he was telling us about this young band, The Who, and to be honest, very few of us, including me at that moment, that point in time, hadn't heard of The Who really. Might have seen their posters up somewhere, but we hadn't seen them. And here's this young guy saying, oh, you should be writing about The Who, why are you putting all this rubbish on the front page? we want to hear about Keith Moon and Pete Townshend and Roger Daltrey. So eventually he'd be given, all right, okay, go off and do an interview. And of course, within a few months or so, they would be the #1 band, top of the charts.
The first gig I went to was the 21st of April 1967, still have the ticket, it's just got a pop concert on it. And the first act on was, I suppose the first act I had ever seen was a guy called Crispin St. Peters who had a pop single called I'm the Pied Piper. Couldn't wait for him to get off really because I wasn't into the pop music. And then the Mersey Beats came on and did Sorrow, which was passable, but then the Cream came on and I was awestruck because I'd never seen anything like it. And then the Who came on and I was even more awestruck because apart from playing the fantastic pop hits they had at the time, they smashed everything up and they destroyed the stage, and that leaves quite an impression on a 16-year-old that hadn't long stopped being a choir boy.
And here we go with Pete Townshend in his garden. Our editor, Ray Coleman, had the bright idea of asking Pete to write a monthly column for the paper, and because Pete was always sending in letters of complaint about this and that, so we said, why don't you have your own page? You can talk about anything. And he said, well, as long as I can use Wentzell's photographs. So we did various, 3 or 4, I think. He's smashing up TVs in one. This was his daughter had just been born, and he dressed up in this Pearly King outfit with his banjo. This is his dog Towser, who's the actual live, who posed very well, actually, by the way. I asked him to stand by this window, shooting with a 28mm lens, ridiculous. I'm sorry his nose got so big, but it just seemed to be that. And as we were shooting this, he was talking about this idea he had for a rock opera about a deaf, dumb and blind kid, and I'm going, sounds interesting, very cheery, Pete. I can't ever see that being a hit somehow, but I didn't say anything, and who knows later, Tommy is whatever. Incredibly deep chap there.
Out of the pop group, the Beatles, came this force to make people listen differently.
Everybody was different, Cat Stevens to Nick Drake to Pentangle, Jimi Hendrix, Third Ear Band. Everybody got a gig because they didn't know what was going to sell.
I fell more in with a Motown fan originally, but the first record I think I bought was Paint It Black, which I'm not sure was about 1966. My sisters used to sort of jockey for my favour, and one of them was in the protest movement. Say the Beatles fan was just looking for boys. It's funny how music defined who you were so much.
It was all about the youth culture, for once, pimply kids from Nottingham or Liverpool or Manchester or little yobs from Gravesend could get a guitar if they could find one, learn how to play, which was difficult because there weren't any guitar teachers. So most people learned from playing records and going, hey, or passing it on. Hey, I found this new chord, you know, like Steve Marriott. Hey, I found out how to play our single. Oh wow, who are we doing that? I don't know, but I found this chord. It's wonderful. Listen to this, and I can move it up and down now. So it was all that experiment and recording techniques and the performance were all things that were made up. You know, it started from little clubs and pubs, and then it became huge stadiums and a commercial business like it is now. You know, but youth created that, and spontaneity, but just by being told we couldn't do it was. We're gonna do it. What do you mean? Rock and roll. This is Jimmy Page by Old Father Thames. Jimmy was a session musician. He played on practically everybody's gigs, I think, and obviously learned how to do everything. And we went down to visit him. He just formed this band. It's going to be called Led Zeppelin. When Jimmy Page was doing his session work, the violin player came up and said, you ever tried using the bow? Try that. So, oh, that's great. So he learned the bow technique from an old session musician he was working with.
We saw Led Zeppelin playing in Belfast and Dublin at the height of the Troubles.
Usher Hall it was, and the Protestants and the Catholics had been fighting outside, and it was peace and quiet inside.
I asked Robert, getting off the plane, I thought, what was that new song? He said, oh, that's called Stairway to Heaven. So that's the first time people had heard it.
You couldn't be apolitical in the 60s. The women's movement, the ecological movement, the civil rights movement, a back to the earth movement. We were worried about the oil running out in the year 2000. It was supposed to be all gone, the deforestation, the this, the that. Nelson Mandela was put in jail for just being, and thousands of people marched around Trafalgar Square to protest.
Even though the Vietnam War was happening, with a different country, different place, we still saw there was a little clip on the end of the news every night which had the body count and what was happening, and the soundtrack to that for us was the Temptations and the Stones.
House of the Rising Sun, which I've sung forever. It's more than a song, And then the stuff that I recorded that became big with the serving military as far back as the Vietnam conflict. I still get Vietnam vets coming up to me today and saying, "Man, you saved my life." And I'm like, inside, I'm wondering, is this a joke? Should I be laughing at this? But then they go on to explain the story, wow, it's really, that's a big compliment. That affects me a lot, and that makes me believe in the power of music.
The content of Melody Maker was, it should have been a kind of democratic process, but like most newspapers or magazines, you always have a weekly conference. Everybody gets together and has to decide on the important essentials. Who's going to be the main interview of the week? Who's going to be on the front cover?
There was a certain amount of delegation as to who wrote about which acts, but that occurred through as much our choice as the editor, Ray, didn't say, you write about this act, you write about that act. He more or less said, who would you like to write about?
The editor would say, well, the Monkees, they're number one in the charts. Everybody's raving about the Monkees. We've got to have them on the cover. And I, or my fellow writers, would say, well, for God's sake, no. We've just seen Jimi Hendrix playing in a small club. He's a genius. We've got to write about Jimi Hendrix. So you'd have this argument going on between the bosses and the workers.
I think it was always Chris Welch writing about the Cream, the Who, the Pink Floyd, or American bands, Zappa, or the Airplane, or the Doors. And that was the only way you could find out. You didn't have Google then, didn't have the internet, where you wanted to find out something instantly. You had to wait till Thursday came round.
I wanted to support the acts and at the same time make it exciting and interesting and amuse the readers at the same time. I always thought of the reader wants to know as much as possible about this group that I'm privileged to be in contact with. I remember one editor saying to me, I said, I'd like to do a piece on David Bowie. David Bowie, boring, he said. This is shortly before Ziggy Stardust burst upon the world.
The musicians would actually come into the office to be interviewed, which is inconceivable today.
We had one famous singer came up and was thrown out. Who was that guy, do you remember?
Bob Dylan, I think, wasn't it? Looking for Max Jones, yeah.
I wasn't there, but I heard that he came to the back door by mistake instead of the front reception and said, I want to see the editor, and the security man told him to clear off. He'd never heard of Bob Dylan, and
not many people had at that time.
No. It was pretty early part of his career.
I looked in my diary, October 1970. It said 4 p.m. Elton John, Melody Maker, and he just turned up. You know, he didn't even come with anybody. He just turned up. We went round to the pub, the Red Lion, round the back of it, and sat there. I had my notebook, and he had a pint, and did an interview, and that was the way it was.
Nowadays, you tend to think that everybody in London in the swinging 60s or 70s dressed in sort of hippie mode. On one famous occasion, David Bowie was just beginning to make his name, but he came in to be interviewed and was wearing what we thought of was a woman's dress. In fact, I guess it was a caftan. I think Chris Welch took him to the Red Lion, which, as I say, was quite a formal pub with lots of pinstripe suits and and so Chris sat down with Bowie, who was also heavily made up, as I recall.
And we had an old guy called Chris Hayes on the paper, who'd been on the paper for donkey's years. He'd been there since the 30s or 40s, I don't know, right? Old jazz writer. And he was now employed solely to do this Any Questions column. And he had like a phone book full of everybody's numbers. And he had Townshend's number, and he had Eric Clapton's number, and I don't know who else's number he had. And he'd ring them up, and he'd say, hello, Pete. It's Chris Hayes, Any Questions column from Melody Maker here. Got a reader in Leicester, wants to know what kind of echo you use. Oh, I use a vibraphone Echoplex or whatever. I get them for 80 odd quid. I plug that in directly from my amp, Echoplex, into the amp. I usually have two on stage in case one breaks down. So you tell him, and Chris will go, oh, say that again. How do you spell that?
As well as writing news stories and interviews, I also did quite a lot of gossip. We had a regular gossip column in Melody Maker. It was called The Raver. But the Ravers were a particular breed of people who enjoyed life to the full, a bit like sort of beatniks or hippies later. So when we invented the gossip column, it became the Raver column.
You'd read his column to see what you'd said. In fact, what you'd said wasn't actually what was written, but it made it very funny.
So I couldn't resist just making people up and putting them in ludicrous situations. One of the names I invented was Jiving K Boots, who happened to be an imaginary, ludicrous rock and roll singer with a terribly inflated sense of his own importance. It was based on a few real people, of course. They were kind of not that famous, but thought they were. And they'd go to all the receptions and all the clubs, and they wanted to be gossip columnist stars, so I'd made up this name and they would be it.
What really interested me was the back pages, the adverts. You could find musicians, you could find equipment to buy, but most importantly, all the gigs, all the listings, the Marquee Club, the Country Club, the Roundhouse, the Lyceum.
Looking in the thing and finding out all the different folk clubs and what night they were on, and planning how I was going to go and do a floor spot at all of these.
From Melody Maker, Enemy and Sound, we advertised in all three. So there was another significance. As a fan of music originally, but then as a person working in the game, that's where you put your ads.
I was on the newsagent's stand, so I was responsible for selling newspapers, magazines of a broad variety, and so Melody Maker would usually be secreted in my jacket when I went off for my lunch break, and I would read Melody Maker cover to cover in 20 minutes or whatever.
It's been the backbone of the British music industry forever.
It was hugely influential, and it was the Bible for those interested in rock and roll music.
Melody Maker was the Bible. It was every week. I never ever imagined that there would be a week when I wouldn't buy Melody Maker and read it from cover to cover.
You'd buy it every week just to see who was on where and whether you could get to more than one place in an evening.
Almost all the really mega bands of the 70s, were formed as a result of an advertisement in Melody Maker. Vocalists wanted, musicians wanted, engagements wanted, drummer wanted.
Well, there were either gig ads for clubs classified ads for musicians wanted or musicians advertising their services, or they were musical instruments for sale, like guitars and drums and basses and pianos and saxophones and you name it. And this was a throwback from Melody Maker's original function as a musician's trade paper.
I remember that it would be drummer required for name band, no breadheads. It was always no breadheads. In other words, there's no bloody money in this, so forget it if you need to get paid.
You knew you would get replies within the week, so it wasn't like advertising in a monthly magazine. And it wasn't that expensive to advertise. I used it to find Giles and Fripp. So without Melody Maker, King Crimson might have been a different little animal.
Roxy Music found their drummer through the Melody Maker. That kind of thing went on all the time.
When Brian Jones, Ian Stewart were forming the Rolling Stones, who were the two original founder members before Keith and Mick joined, I think that was advertised as a gig for a blues band.
So it just mushroomed along the way. So these classified ads in the back of occupied more and more space.
The bands that are still around today, but now, are superstars, started out answering one of these tiny little advertisements.
It was work and fun all rolled into one, and it was hard to define what was what, because we're all experimenters as we went along. I was learning how to take pictures. The musicians were learning how to play their instruments, like Pink Floyd. The first gig, it was like, tuning up. It was just experimental. Eventually they learned new chords and whatever, like everybody else did.
Unless you went to the gig and saw them up there and saw what they looked like, you didn't know what Led Zeppelin looked like. You didn't know what the difference between Robert Plant and Jimmy Page, unless you bought the music press.
The first time I ever saw them play was in 1964 on a Sunday afternoon in a little club just off Charing Cross Road, and they played to 40 people for free, and they were fantastic, a real Chicago blues band. And Brian Jones going, "Hey, look at my slide," and he was the first one to ever use a slide emulating Muddy Waters and Bo Diddley. Bands would come along and promote their latest single, and the Stones played 3 or 4 numbers, I think. Whatever that little frame is that moment stands out from the others. Oh, that's the one. Everything sort of comes together. That's what Cartier-Bresson said. He said he just stood there and just watched, and gradually things had moved to click. He got it. He just knew. It was like Zen in the art of photography to me. It was like, you don't think, man, this finger just does whatever it wants. And I didn't have any control over that, because, hey, stop that, it's like you were just a vehicle for all that to come through, because you weren't thinking about it. And like people like Hendrix and a lot of other characters told me that, and then when they were playing, we just got lost in it. I don't know whether the guitar was playing me, I was playing the guitar.
He'd have his roll hanging up somewhere, a film. He'd have the enlarger on, take the lights out, red light, take the film, run it through the enlarger, go, oh, yeah, not that one. Oh, that one looks good. No contact sheet or anything. Print it, check, maybe see if there was anything else, and then that was it. I don't know whether the negs were then put away somewhere, never to see the light of day again, actually, or because he'd be on to the next job.
Everything had to be in by Monday, so you had to, no matter what, fill the paper. There was there can't be a spare gap in the front page. So it was like I learned professionalism. Clack, 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 click, 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 back in the dark and do that. That's over. Now we can party, or we party in between, but somehow it all got done.
Because we were often working under a lot of time constraints, if we could leave a hole on the page. We could lay out the feature knowing that it would be good, an indicator of how much trust we had in him.
We were lucky to have a staff photographer, and we were particularly lucky to have one. Not just as skilled as Barry and with as good an eye, but who had a very identifiable style. Ray or I could get him to go off to do what would turn out to be the cover image that week. And not only was it a very powerful image in its own right, it had a particular style, a particular look that was Barry's, but became the Melody Makers in that time.
I noticed Barry particularly because he used to come late. He used to, whether he was in the bar or not, I don't know where he was, but he used to come late, and then he always got the best shots because he'd do the encore or something, or when the rest of the pack had gone home or they'd run out of film or something, Barry would come in for the last 3 songs and get the best pictures.
Because of the power of Melody Maker, he had good access, and the bands were happy to let Barry just hang out, really, and he had the time to be able to get those casual, fairly natural-looking shots.
This, I think, is done somewhere in London, Islington, I think it was. We went to do an interview with Roger, and he was just sitting there, not doing much, and one cat sort of got up and walked across the table, sat there, another cat came and sat, and then another one, and then they all suddenly looked out the window, and it was like, oh, that's the shot,
I associate him particularly with Chris Welch. They were sort of a double act, I think, really, and they complemented each other quite well. Chris was very bubbly, funny character. Barry could be funny as well, but as I recall, in quite a sort of a quiet, sardonic sort of way.
Barry would be out on the key assignments, and it was much later that I started getting the key assignments. So we did a couple of jobs together. I think one of the first times I went on the road with the band was Roxy Music when they did their Country Life tour, and I remember going down to Cardiff with Barry. But other than that, he was usually off with Chris Welch. He and Chris were kind of like a legendary double act.
The paper was a big supporter of Yes, and especially Chris Welch, and of course Barry Wentzell was his partner in crime. Came along with the camera to take the pictures, and Chris wrote the articles.
He didn't like his pictures messed around. He didn't like them cropped, cut to fit. He didn't like type superimposed on them. And he didn't stamp his foot and rave and rant, but in his quiet way, he made it pretty clear that he wanted his pictures treated with respect.
I was an avid reader of the Melody Maker, and I'd seen Barry Wentzell's name on the photographs, and I thought, I was really nervous actually about phoning up the Melody Maker to see whether he'd take the photographs. And he came on and I said, look, we need some photographs taken. He said, of course. Took these wonderful photographs that have been used for publicity for years and years. You need the marquee, because that was a favourite haunt of the Melody Maker. If you didn't do the marquee, you weren't anybody. And so we were thrilled when we got our first booking there.
The manager of the Marquee Club, John G., who was by repute a rather fierce man who took no hostages. If he didn't like a band, he would just chuck them out.
We were picked up by Long John Baldry.
He took a shine to us, I think, on the 3rd or 4th visit.
He had his big band playing at the Marquee and said, would we like to go and do the intervals for him?
We became a resident Marquee band.
And he would have had Rod Stewart with him and Elton John on piano at the time. It was a fantastic experience for us.
And the Marquee was world famous. And you're advertising the Marquee right in that size, it wasn't big, but we could see it,
Any good musician played the Marquee Club, all the greatest bands. And we were resident there. We played there every Tuesday night.
The first time we went was as the John Evan Band in 1967. I think we supported a band called The Herd, whose singer was Peter Frampton.
We turned up there one night on a Tuesday night, and we were expecting to play with a band called Cliff Bennett and the Rebel Rousers.
We got to appear on the national the Jazz and Blues Festival at Sunbury. It was held in that year, in summer of '68. which was our first time to play in front of a large audience, which essentially took us by surprise that they knew who we were.
And we were told, oh, Cliff's sick and we've had to get a replacement.
20 people who'd seen us at Doncaster, 20 people who'd seen us at Bristol, and maybe 200 people who'd seen us at the Marquee Club. But you put all that together and suddenly, wow, you know, we got this huge ovation, and we thought of ourselves as an unknown band.
There's some band that's just arrived in the UK, some guitarist.
And he's left-handed. And I say, oh, right, yeah, and he's black and he's from Chicago. And I said, well, it sounds fantastic.
No one had ever seen this guy.
Hold on, mate, he plays the guitar with his teeth.
You can guess who the guitarist was. That night changed rock history. We walked out and I looked down, and here, like you're there, were the Beatles. The 4 Beatles just sitting there. And these are my heroes, of course, and I'm 17 at the time. And then I looked there, and next to him was Mick Jagger, and the Stones were there. Clapton was there. And they reckon that night changed the way the rock guitar was played. And of course, the other thing was, that was the start of introducing Jimi Hendrix to the world.
I do remember the first time I really was aware that he was Jimi Hendrix. There was a Lulu show he did where he was playing live and rehearsing, and it was at the BBC, and the 2 engineers at the back, real English rednecks, said something about, who's this coon? Let's pull the plug out on him. And they pulled the plug out while he was in the middle of rehearsing for the Lulu show. And then we went backstage and I said, man, that really must be upsetting. He said, come to expect it. And I mean, that's the first time I realised he was black, you know. We didn't think about colour or anything, because I was photographing black and white anyway. Everybody's in black and white. He was a really sweet chap, very quiet, very soft-spoken, great sense of humour, very optimistic and very futuristic thinking, incredible player. Totally different off stage than on, you know.
The idea was to make Melody Maker then, in the 60s, look like a national daily newspaper, rather like the Daily Mirror, or to an extent the Sun today, you know, dramatic headlines, drawing readers in. So you grab your attention if you're standing in a newsagent's and you see the paper, big headline, Beatles to split horror.
Ray Coleman loved big headlines, you know, Beatles to reform. That must have been our favourite, actually, they never did. Elvis to tour the UK was another one, right? Promoter Harvey Goldsmith this week revealed that he'd sent a telegram to Colonel Tom Parker offering £1 million to Elvis Presley to perform. Quote from Harvey Goldsmith, I'm hoping to put him on at Wembley Stadium in June. Well, it never happened, could he? Harvey just wanted a front page.
Ray Coleman, the editor of Melody Maker, hatched a plot with our manager, Terry Ellis, to follow up one headline story with another one, a concocted story about Jethro Tull quit in the light of this negative review, which was unbelievably stupid to have done, because Ray knew full well that this was not true. It was just to get another mutually sort of agreed headline story. And I didn't know anything about this until I was walking down Oxford Street and saw Melody Maker on the newsstand saying Jethro Tull quit, and I thought, what?
They loved us to be bad boys. So that's what I did. You know, I was just like, I was as bad as I could be within the realm of cool, you know. And I was always getting reviews and comments in the musical press that I drove like a maniac through the streets of London in my imported Corvette from US, and I was pretty obnoxious when I was younger. I would not like to be in the same room with me as I was then these days. You know? So I guess that sums it up.
The one that I remember vividly was Springsteen to support Straubs, and that was a complete fabrication, and thank God it never happened. Because when I saw him play for the first time, I thought, thank God we didn't have to follow him on stage. It would have been a dreadful, appalling problem.
There were so many stories with Keith Moon because, I mean, he was both a publicist's delight and a nightmare.
I saw Moon lob a TV set out of a window.
He was a lovely, lovely man.
On one occasion, he decided that the latest mode of transport to acquire was a hovercraft, and I was looking for a bit of publicity for The Who on that particular week.
What happened was, we did a gig, it was a great gig, and people went back to the hotel, so we went up to his room. Eventually Keith was the only one left standing, which was always the case.
We drummed together for the Bonzos.
And there was a go-slow strike on the railway in England. What a great shot, Moon and his hovercraft, hovering across above railway lines, disappear into the distance, right? And this is Keith Moon, he doesn't go the normal way, of course, he's got a hovercraft.
He'd climb from Old Compton Street to Wardour Street over the roofs.
And someone turned the telly on, they're watching telly, and Keith's telling jokes and what have you. We put some bottles up there, obviously, right? And someone asked Keith to shut up.
He'd only ever drink triple brandy, and he'd take these pills as well. I never saw him take any pills, but I know he did.
We went down there with the hovercraft on the back of a truck, which Moon sat in, dressed as Field Marshal Rommel, with his field glasses, revving up the engine all the way through, giving the Nazi salute.
He just wandered over and said, "What'd you say? What'd you say? Oh, you're watching telly, are you? Oh, sorry about that." Wrenched it off its wall, walked over to the window and lobbed it out. And we were about 8 floors up, you know. It went crashing down. We just knew that sooner or later there was going to be a knock on the door.
Got it onto the middle of the railway lines. It flooded. So we've now got a hovercraft stuck in the middle of the railway track. So any minute I'm expecting the disaster of a train round the corner, you know, the hovercraft there, publicist kills 200, whatever. I can see the headlines. But this showed Moon's kind of inspirational mode, if you like.
Keith said it was an accident. I can't believe it. He said, "I'm so terribly sorry. I was moving the television and it slipped out of my hand. I'm terribly sorry. It was a shocking accident." I said, "Oh God, I hope no one was down there." No.
And he'd climb down into this club where we'd all drink. It was like a nightclub. It was about as big as this room, called the Chasse.
He leapt off the hovercraft and went to the phone that they have, which is attached to the nearest signal box for emergency purposes, picked up the phone and announced himself as Harry Webb, which was Cliff Richard's real name. "It's Harry here, Harry Webb. Yeah, you got all the gumph, did you, about the heavy load coming through with the transistors on the back?" We then had to get the car and go to the garage back in Chertsey and get a steel tow because we attached the one we had. That snapped. The hour had almost elapsed. Moon's back on the phone again. "It's Harry again. You won't believe this. And we got 200 foot of copper wire all over your rails." "What?" "Well, I can't help that. You know, we'll just clear as soon as we can, you know." Bang again. He stopped the trains coming down there for nearly 2 hours.
If you're going downstairs, you know, to get something to put on the window, he said, would you mind bringing up 2 more bottles of champagne? And he said, and another telly as well.
He'd climb right the way down and in through the window, and then he'd say, "Mine's a triple, please."
We just put people on the front page we liked, which was like amazing. That's how Genesis, Joe Cocker, Elton John, and a load of characters got on the front page or articles in the paper. It was we were given freedom.
And that power meant that if we chose to put someone on the front page of Melody Maker who had hitherto not been particularly successful, but we thought deserved to be successful, chances were their album would sell in droves.
My most exciting moment probably in my musical career was when I appeared on the front cover of Melody Maker.
We did spectacularly with David Bowie when Hunky Dory came out, and my colleague Michael Watts did that famous interview where he said he was gay, when suddenly David Bowie was huge.
Music papers then had tremendous power and importance because there was no internet, there was very little, there was certainly no music news on television.
So if you got a listing and you're in an ad, what you then want to see would be a live review.
Barry Wentzell had come out to Amsterdam with us when we played at the concert Gabal. So it was newsworthy that he was covering our first European tour.
The feature might be a half page or a full page and then 2 pages, and and then the cover.
We could make or break hit records by promoting them, putting them on the front cover.
But when it appeared on the front cover of Melody Maker, my head swelled up enormously.
The only way to break a band in those days was through the Melody Maker.
Perhaps we weren't thinking in those terms when we were doing it.
We had a role to play that wasn't just simply, promoting the music.
The public knew about them, but maybe the industry at large didn't know about them. So what Melody Maker could do was, once they were on the cover, they'd then automatically be on radio and TV as well. So big stepping stone up.
Peter Gabriel had these things made. They were like flower heads and boxes and things that he'd wear. Because Barry was a pal of mine, I took him up there in the afternoon, and we got these great pictures of Gabriel rehearsing with all the lights on. The next week, when they had their meeting and he took his photos in to see which would go on the front cover, he only had these Genesis pictures, and we'd arranged it that way. And they went from £300-500 a night to thousands overnight. That was it. It just broke them because the photo was on the cover. So anybody that went on the cover, their career just went.
I bought albums because Melody Maker said, new band, great.
You became who you were as a performer in those days because you saw yourself on the front page of Melody Maker, and that became you. And you started to think of yourself perhaps as that stage persona. And so it got a little bit theatrical and maybe a little bit over the top.
You know that you've made it. You know, when you're on the front of Melody Maker, it's like something getting the women on the front of Vogue. You know, that was the equivalent of that, you know.
And I don't know if Barry knows how many times I was on the front page symbolising yes, and that was a great honour. Not only did I have like a dress on and stuff like this, but I used to find that you needed something to wear that looked exciting, you know, and men's clothes were crap.
The readers would vote in, favourite group, favourite singer, favourite girl singer, album of the year, live act, bass player, guitarist, whatever, all these different categories. And we'd have a poll awards party in September at a big hotel, and all the acts would turn up, of course. And this was a big deal. I think they just create awards now in the hope that they can get TV coverage and then sponsorship.
They used to do this thing called Blind Date. They'd play you sort of like 12 singles, and you just have to give your instant impression of what you just heard. Certainly did that in Melody Maker.
There was a difference, I suppose, between what we might call music journalism and music criticism. I like to think I sort of spanned both those areas, but I used to see myself foremost as a journalist, a music journalist, reporting on the scene and also crusading for the artists.
Which isn't to say that it was sycophantic towards them.
Then you had to be a critic too when the albums came out, and you'd have to distance yourself a bit and try not to be too partisan and maintain a kind of critical stance. And sometimes that would get me into trouble. I'd feel that I didn't want to appear to be a PR for groups. You had to be a critic too.
I saved up my pocket money for 4 or 5 weeks, and in those days used to go in the music booths in record stores, and you could listen to records all day, 7 inches,
If you didn't particularly like a single or thought it wasn't very good, you could have some fun and write a kind of surreal review of that. The whole record industry was booming, and there was this enormous competition going on between all the groups to release new albums and get into the charts. So we were being deluged with LPs at the same time.
Going all the way to Paris to wait for David Bowie to return from his American tour because he wouldn't fly, so everything was by sea or rail. There was a sort of embargo on taking pictures, and the management wasn't helping us. We went secretly to meet David Bowie. Unfortunately, the paper put us up in the Georges V Hotel, which is the most expensive hotel on the planet, with very little money. David didn't turn up the first day, so we were a bit, so we went up and drank all the bar dry, of course, thinking Melody Maker would pay for the expenses. Next day, no sign of David Bowie. We're combing all the railway stations. He hasn't arrived. It's our second day. We've gone out and partied at all the clubs and spent all our money. And then suddenly David Bowie turns up, 2.5 days late. connection. The next train was connecting to a hovercraft, which flies about 4 feet off the ground, I guess, and he wasn't having that. And Angie, his wife, said, no, David, it's not like that, it's more like a boat. We get on the train, then we've forgotten we don't have any money. The ticket collector comes around and say, I'm sorry, but we can't pay, we're going to be thrown off. And David says, no, it's okay, I'll pay for you. So David Bowie pays for us to come back to England, and I still owe him for the train fare.
You observed them over the course of 48 hours or 3 days, and well, I'd sit down, talk to them in the plane and what have you, but you didn't have to set up, you know, this actual 60-minute interview. And if you went over the 60 minutes, then woe betide, you kicked out the door, the next one's wheeled in. I went on tour with Led Zeppelin and saw 3 or 4 gigs on the trot. I travelled with them on their private plane. We saw everything when we were on the road with them. With Led Zeppelin or The Who or The Faces or Deep Purple, I went with all these acts on the tour. Alice Cooper as well, for that matter.
There was much more trust in those days, but also you have to take into account the fact that the type of journalism was not particularly probing. It wasn't investigative journalism. It wasn't the kind of journalism which became popular later.
I saw all the bad behaviour, if you want to call it that, or the indiscretions, but we didn't report on that. We just took it for granted that this was how rock stars on the road behaved.
There were things you wouldn't write about, not only because you didn't want to spoil the relationship between yourself and the artist concerned, but the papers didn't require it.
So none of that stuff appeared in the stories that we wrote. I'd be vague hints, but you know, we were discreet, very discreet around them, and so they knew they could trust us.
Back then there was no makeup artist, there was no manager. You went round to see somebody or they turned up at the studio and it was just like, hey Eric, can you stand there, do that or whatever, and you're off down the pub having a drink with them, then off to a club somewhere, or they were playing a gig and you go along. It was just like a bunch of friends. This is the Rolling Stones in an Elizabethan banqueting hall in Kensington somewhere. They were launching Beggar's Banquet, I believe. It must have been with this. They invited about 12 of us along to this luncheon. It was an old English thing with serving wenches, blah-de-blah, glasses of mead. We're all getting really happy. The Stones aren't there. They turn up through this doorway and throw custard pies at us. You know, they love to get back at the press. And so we're all covered in custard pies. We start throwing them back at them. It ends up in a sort of bun fight, and people are very covered with cream and stuff. But I think it's the last shot I got of the whole group together.
I was actually in the recording studio in Barnes when Brian died, when they brought the news into the studio that he died in the swimming pool that night. And I was sworn to secrecy by Keith, who said, look, we haven't even been able to get to the family yet to tell them you're not to write anything about this. You know, even though you're here and you know it, don't go freelancing this anywhere. I said, I promise. And you don't break a promise to Keith Richards. So I had probably the biggest scoop on the scene at that time, but I couldn't use it. And it was very sad. I mean, in the studio that night, I mean, Marianne Faithfull was in tears, I remember. Keith Richards was certainly deeply moved by it. Mick was kind of angry that Brian had died inconveniently, I think. And then they did the concert with the butterflies and all the rest. It wasn't a great concert, to be honest, but it was extremely memorable. Partly it wasn't a great concert because Mick Taylor had just been introduced into the band. It was his first gig, and he didn't really fit yet. He hadn't worked it out. And then there were the farce of the butterflies, of course, which were all tipped out of the box and were all dead. So you had Mick dancing on dead butterflies, you know. I mean, that was reading Shelley, you know, I mean, that was pretty ick-making.
Here's the amazing spotty Sid Barrett. We went down to do an interview with him, and his manager came up very apologetically saying, Sid has locked himself in a room and he won't come out. Can you speak through the keyhole and try and get him out. So we knocked on the door, and it opened a crack, and this little eye appeared, and this very frightened character saying, is that you guys? I said, yes, it's us. Said, quick, come in. And he opened the door, we came in, he locked the door again, put the key back in his pocket, and then started to tell us that his management were aliens and they were after him and he was trying to escape. Very sad.
Between the 60s and the 70s, the whole rock industry took off. Everything got bigger and louder and better. The concept album appeared, records started selling in their millions, gold and platinum albums. And reflecting that growth, Melody Maker grew in size, you know, from maybe 32 pages a week, costing a shilling, something like that. We'd get up to enormous, very large issues.
They would even take out a 4-page advertisement just to advertise a single.
Melody Maker was the jewel in the crown of IPC, it was. It was making an absolute packet. I'm sure it was. An absolute packet it was from this advertising revenue.
When we were there, it was on the way to selling almost 200,000 copies a week. You'd go to work on the subway on a Thursday morning, and everybody between the ages of about 14 and 20 would be reading the Melody Maker.
Yeah, incredibly successful. Enemy, on the other hand, was looking at extinction.
This was taken in his manager's office, Mike Jeffries, in Soho, when he'd just come back from a tour of the States. He was looking really exhausted and tired, and I went, oh, fuck, I shouldn't really be taking pictures. But he said, no, man, that's okay. You know, pressure of business, it's really better. He looked a bit down, and the pressure of work and business was getting to him. Just wanting to play music and record, and I don't think he really liked all that fame and acclaim, you know. It was like you couldn't escape it, but he'd become a character, everybody who's making money for people. It was like, too late to stop now. The management back then were making you go here, there and everywhere. You know, you go up to Liverpool, then back to Margate, then up to there. You'd be totally touring, and his manager was off to the Bahamas banking stuff, but they never saw it in the end. Probably died with about 50 quid on it. And there he is.
He should have really gotten into jazz. If he'd have played with jazz musicians in America, that would have been it. He could have got away from all the rock and roll. He just went on the wrong path. There was no one looking after him. Well, it happened with Elvis Presley. He was driven into the ground by his manager, wasn't he? Colonel Parker, you know, he made him do all those shitty films, and he made him do Las Vegas. I mean, he was the hottest thing in the world when he got hold of him, and then he drove him into the ground, didn't he? So he just ended up a big fat guy sitting on the toilet with a heart attack.
We once got into a bit of trouble with Peter Grant, Led Zeppelin's notoriously belligerent manager, we had a cartoonist called Barry Fantoni. It was rumoured that Peter Grant was going to take over the management of Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and he drew a cartoon of a whale, right, which was actually had Peter Grant's face on it, right, because Peter Grant was a very large man indeed, 20 stone, you know, and inside the whale, Jonah on a raft, was one raft with Led Zeppelin on and another raft with Emerson, Lake and Palmer on, and coming out of its spout were £5 notes, you know, and Peter Grant took exception to that. I know he did, and called up Ray Coleman, and I'm glad it was Ray he called and not me, because he was a terrifying man.
Walking around with Peter Grant around this huge stadium, and we found these two guys with twin microphones and enormous tape recorders, so bootlegging the concert. So Peter just grabbed the tapes out of the machine and tore them all up and smashed the microphones, wrecked all the equipment. And the owner, the German kid who owned all this equipment, was outraged and ran off and brought a policeman. And this policeman came up and he had a gun on his belt and a nightclub, a big stick, and a crash helmet on. He really looked the part. Anyway, he took one look at Peter Grant, shook his head and ran off. Grant was so intimidating he decided not to bother to arrest him. He had an Alsatian dog as well.
I'd do the dog first.
Melody Maker was making so much money in those days that they could afford to do more or less what they liked. And the editor in those days, this is Ray Coleman, liked the idea of us becoming more international. So he persuaded the management of IPC, the publishers, to set up a New York office.
And the idea was that each member of the staff who had this job would go out for 6 months and come back home again, and then someone else would have a crack at it. Because everybody wanted to do this because it was fabulous, because they set you up in your own apartment in New York, they paid the rent, they paid all your bills, they gave you a living allowance, and you just did it. You know, you worked from home. It was a brilliant job.
I ran out of money, so I called Chris Charlesworth up, who was the correspondent in New York, and he said I could sleep on his couch. So I stopped with him for about 1.5 years.
I was treated like a king and given the red carpet treatment by all these record companies, weren't I? So they would always be taking me out to lunch and taking me out to dinner, and they would, you know, I had all my tickets to concerts were free, weren't they? You know, and all these records that were piling up in my corner.
Well, he was on the A list, which means you get everything, classical records and everything.
Every record company would send me all their records. And in London, I mean, they'd send every record to Melody Maker, but it was, you know, divvied out amongst 6 or 7 staff, wouldn't it? Well, there was only me, so I had no one to divvy it out with.
His flat was literally floor to ceiling with albums.
Well, I get duplicates as well, because with the big acts, I'd get one from the record company, one from the PR, and I'd get one from the management company else.
And I'd wheel them down on a wheelbarrow. I think we actually bought a wheelbarrow, especially for the albums.
And that's the big stuff that the shop wanted. That's Led Zepp, you know. So I got 3 copies of Led Zepp's 5th album or something. I only want one, don't I?
As fast as they were coming in, I was going down the road and selling them, because we kind of lived on that money, and we spent it on beer, on Heineken.
So once I went to 3 shows in one night in New York, I remember. I went to see Johnny
Cash first. I was sat next to his mum.
I saw the Beach Boys at Madison Square Garden above the Felt Forum. And I caught a late night show by Patti Smith at the Bottom Line.
And then we went off dancing in some skyscraper after that. Incredible.
The magazine was well sought after in New York. People used to fly the magazine over to, and used to turn up like 2 or 3 days later after publication. When we were out there, we'd try and get hold of a copy, you know, to try and find out, see what's going on at home, you know.
We had a plan to publish an American edition of Melody Maker, which would be printed in New York and hopefully circulated in America.
You know, they didn't sell any copies of the paper. They printed it up, and I guess they all got lost. It was a prestige thing, I think.
This failed, did this scheme. It failed because no one at IPC, who were the publishers of Melody Maker, was prepared to pay the kickbacks to the mafia to ensure that the magazines found their way to the newsstands and were displayed prominently.
I doubt they sold 1 copy. I used to have to go around and give them away to people, you know.
If you didn't, you know, stick $1,000 in a brown envelope and give it to Salvatore Arganoleva, right, down in Little Italy, then your magazines would end up on a skip or in a dump somewhere, you know, the other side of Kennedy Airport.
It was a folly, I guess.
It's inconceivable that a magazine could afford to do any of that stuff today. But we were big fish in a very small sea, and there was a lot of money being made, and they could afford to do it.
The music industry did reach a bloated kind of level where everything was to excess. Everybody was earning millions of dollars. Everybody had to fly on a private jet.
There was a sea change when the tabloid press in the UK, that is the tabloid press that are interested in scandal, became interested in rock and roll.
We were the first to be subject to the paparazzi.
You couldn't say just between you and me, or off the record, or I would tell you this, but please don't repeat it. You couldn't have that relation. You had to adopt the attitude that everything you said in front of a journalist, whether they had a notebook out or a tape recorder at the time or not, didn't matter, was likely to go into the paper.
I think it was Mick Jagger in about 1973. We were at the Wembley Arena and the Stones were playing, and he came out and announced in his poncy way that the photographers would be thrown out after the first 3 numbers. And I go, shit, man, what have we done? You know, we helped you take pictures. It was like a new snobby thing to do, you know. And then David Bowie's management wouldn't allow pictures to be taken, and a lot of people started to become a bit difficult about it.
When some of them started dying, and dying probably, how can I say, in unpleasant ways, then they started to take an interest in what are these guys up to, you know, off limits and what have you. And then the doors started closing.
Probably wouldn't be on the planet. Tried to have carried on during the silly 70s when the drugs became paramount in people's egos, and I don't know, things got really silly, so I went, screw that, I'm going off and doing something else. Just left it all.
We started to notice that there was this punk scene happening, which we didn't really feel part of, although we were playing in the same venues and playing pretty much to the same audiences and playing, you know, fast rock and roll music really, or, you know, frantic music.
Punk happened, well, it wasn't called punk really in America. It was eventually, but it was just new, young, unsigned bands who were the next generation, really.
Just as I liked the hippie energy, I liked this thing, and then it just happened overnight. There was something in the media about safety pins and punks and things like that, and suddenly the thing exploded.
The great thing about punk was, you know, like the black blues and early jazz in America, it was authentic. And the key to that was the fact that you could have the idea to be in a band, you could pick up an instrument for the first time, or in the space of days, the worst couple of weeks, that band could be playing in public.
When I saw the Ramones for the first time, I didn't know what was going on because the songs lasted about 20 seconds, or they appeared to, and I was used to seeing Zeppelin, Stairway to Heaven, for 20 minutes. Melody Maker was slow off the mark with punk and new wave. NME and the other rival magazine, Sounds, were a bit quicker than we were. had a more traditional outlook.
The notorious New Musical Express, or NME, or NME, started off being a pop magazine, very, very poppy, and then decided to get all alternative, and so embraced the emergence of punk, and with that trashed all the bands who had preceded the punk era in the UK in the mid-70s.
To a lot of people in England, it seemed like bands like Yes didn't exist from 1978 or 79 onwards. They disappeared off the universe.
Led Zeppelin, for example, were really criticised, and not just in the music press, but in the national press. I remember the Sunday Times calling them the worst band in the world. I mean, where does that leave you as a writer, you know, writing about them? You think, well, people are saying that about them, maybe I shouldn't bother, you know, what's the point? So you kind of want to walk away from it.
NME's policy for recruitment, they took English graduates out straight from college.
There emerged out of that, of course, a number of journalists who were fairly bolshy. Not so much on Melody Maker, but people like Nick Kent and Charles Shaw Murray, who were in New Musical Express, who were actually really unpleasant guys, who generally speaking, were people who wanted to appear either with street cred or some intellectual equipment, which very often they didn't have. I mean, Nick Kent was a junkie and a wannabe Keith Richards. He was an actual real pain in the arse guy. I gather he's not yet dead.
The Melody Maker wouldn't have entertained punk. In the punk days, you could actually not do interviews. You say, like, we don't want to talk to you, you can fuck off, you know. So it didn't matter. But in the old days, it was all a little bit more polite.
What happened was the pound fell against the dollar big time. And that put all the expenses up. Also, because punk had happened in the UK, there wasn't as much focus on what was going on in America. So those two issues combined to make it uneconomical and impractical to continue having an American editor or American correspondent, whatever you like to call me. In fact, at that point, I resigned from Melody Maker.
I liked the Sex Pistols as a live band, and I liked Billy Idol and Generation X. I went to see them playing, and there were lots of pub rock bands I liked, so I wasn't terrified by the music, I just didn't like the attitude, so that made it difficult to live with. And of course, NME relished in this kind of anarchic rebellion.
I can't remember the names of Melody Maker journalists, but I can remember the NME ones. I think that says it all. There was an ego to the NME.
And I found it difficult to disguise the fact I didn't really like it, so that put me at odds a bit, I suppose, with Melody Maker thinking, oh, we've got to write about punk rock, we're in competition with the NME, you know, we've got to appear as if we know what we're talking about and believe in it. So it was difficult time. And that's what led me really eventually to decide to leave. The irony is, of course, within a decade, all of those bands that were being dismissed as rubbish are now being hailed as icons, gods and rock and roll, members of the Hall of Fame.
If you'd have asked me then, oh, you're going to form a band that's still going to be playing 40 years later, I would have thought you were mad, you know.
We seem to live more in an era of mediocrity. If you think back to the 60s, there's so much. Every vocalist was unique. Winwood, Burden, Marriott, Van Morrison, Jagger, Daltrey. They're all unique. Guitar players, Page, Beck, Clapton, Peter Green. Drummers, Ginger Baker, Keith Moon, John Bonham. I mean, they were all as good as each other, but unique.
I had a long sabbatical of 17 years of, hey, I don't want to do this anymore. Came back to it because people were asking about the old pictures and wanted to use them, and so I had to go back into the vault and look at this stuff, which was traumatic, because I hadn't seen half of it since I took it, and some I've never seen at all because I never printed that.
He asked me to contact the guy that had his negatives, some $250,000 or something. There was some argument going on. I went round there and picked them up. You know, they filled a car. We've got them on a plane and sent them to Toronto. I couldn't insure them. Christie's, I phoned them up and they said they're priceless. So they went there uninsured, so if the plane had crashed, that would have been it.
I came here in '81, right? Unity within diversity, diversity within unity, together we are Ontario. And I went, wow, fuck, that's real John Lennon and Karl Marx. Wow, that's hippie stuff, that's incredible. And I looked up on the door and it had this transit is supported or funded by the government of Ontario, and somebody scrawled out the people of Ontario and went, oh wow, this is a cool place. I don't know, I mean, I hadn't shot for a long time. It was like I hadn't dragged these old cameras out, and then musicians were asking me to take pictures and I'd go, no, I don't do that anymore, you know. But when they came around and played their music, I went, yeah, same as it ever was. Yeah, I remember meeting so-and-so and yeah, but you're very similar. Same party, just different characters. The great thing about Canadian artists is by the time they ever get discovered or down there, you've already got your second, third album, you've got longevity like Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, Oscar Peterson, or the great artists from here. If I'd have been using digital cameras then, I think there wouldn't be as many pictures, there would have been a lot of editing. I kept it all. This is what I used. They're still in sort of semi-working condition. They were just a really nice light Pentax, and they were sort of easy to shoot. They've been old war horses, and they've seen so many artists pass through these lenses. Wow.
The
transition towards the end was really dramatic. The publishing plan, which I disagreed with because I didn't think it was feasible, was that they wanted to get a younger readership, a much younger readership.
We used to have a column called Radio Jazz, and it was just a tiny little thing, and it just listed what radio stations around Europe you could tune into to hear jazz in any given week. Now that had been there since the 30s or something, and I could not bring myself to get rid of it. It would have been a really logical thing just to go, we don't need that anymore. Let's put a bit of Sex Pistols where that was. But it seemed to me to be really part of what the Melody Maker was all about.
Perhaps a case for the fact that its staff became entrenched. We were getting older.
They wanted to create as much space between the two titles as possible. I argued that there was already a great space because we weren't duplicating each other's coverage.
And eventually it was supposed to be folded into New Musical Express, but that didn't really happen.
Basically what they did was disaffect our core readership, which had been loyal for so long. Basically it said, we don't want you. We couldn't have got rid of readers more quickly if we'd gone around to their kind of houses in the middle of the night, kicked down their front door, set fire to the house, killed their cat, kidnapped their children, and laid waste to their property, which is when I started thinking of a way out of Melody Maker. I could only see it going down.
Melody Maker had always survived all these sudden abrupt changes in popular music and culture, whether it was bebop or traditional jazz or later on progressive rock or soul music, Tamla Motown. We used to ride all of these storms and embrace them and think, great, fantastic, we need new music, we need new stuff.
Eventually it changed out of all recognition and it became full of sort of boy bands and chart pop and nothing else. There was nothing left of what it had been. And at that point, obviously, it was no use to anybody. It had lost what it had been and found nothing to replace it and folded. And not before time, actually. I was really pleased to see it go because it had become an absolute travesty of anything that it had ever been when it was worth reading.
I was down at John and Yoko's doing some pictures, and John insisted I take a picture of him and Yoko with his flag, which I thought was rather dangerous as he was intending to move to New York. And he said, no, I insist you take this picture. Lennon's song Imagine should be a reality now. It could have been. Make war, not love is what it's all about now. Everything seems to be backward. Why? It's stupid. Let's give peace a chance, If you want it, it's there.
We were a group of people. We didn't always agree about everything by any means. We used to have ferocious arguments. But we knew that we were in the same boat, and it was the best boat to be in. So I think we formed very, very close friendships. There are people from them. I still think about everybody I knew then, and quite a lot of them I still see or am in contact with in some way or another, and it's a long time ago now. But it was a very, very special time and a very special set of relationships that I think affected everybody very, very, very fundamentally.
Well, if I won the lottery, like the Euro Millions, I would spend it all on reviving Melody Maker in a printed format.
Well, it was the most wonderful job in the world. It was a pleasure and a privilege, and it was the best job I've ever had, and the best job I'm ever likely to have.
I don't know how it happened, but it happened, and it just happened to be coincidental at an amazing time when things were starting up, and 10 years of that was a fun party, You should have been there. It was great.